I'd like to make a statement regarding the latest developments on Hong Kong. As I feared when I addressed the House on the 2nd of June, yesterday the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress in Beijing adopted a wide-ranging national security law for Hong Kong. This is a grave and deeply disturbing step. We've carefully assessed the legislation, and in particular, we've considered its impact on the rights, freedoms, and critically, the high degree of autonomy bestowed on Hong Kong under China's basic law for Hong Kong, as well as under the Joint Declaration, which, as the House will know, is the treaty agreed between China and the UK in 1984. So, Mr. Speaker, today I have the depressing but necessary duty to report to the House that the enactment of this legislation imposed by the authorities in Beijing on the people of Hong Kong constitutes a clear and serious breach of the Joint Declaration. Let me explain to the House the grounds for this sobering conclusion. First, Mr. Speaker, the legislation violates the high degree of autonomy, executive and legislative powers, and independent judicial authority provided for in paragraph 3 of the Joint Declaration. The imposition of this legislation by the government in Beijing, rather than it being left to Hong Kong's own institutions, is also, it should be noted, in direct conflict with Article 23 of China's own basic law for Hong Kong, which affirms that Hong Kong should bring forward its own national security legislation. In fact, the basic law elaborates on this and only allows Beijing to directly impose laws in a very limited number of cases, such as for the purposes of defence, foreign affairs, or in exceptional circumstances in which the National People's Congress declares a state of war or a state of emergency. None of those exceptions apply here, nor has the National People's Congress sought to justify this law on any such ground. Second, Mr. Speaker, the national security legislation contains a slew of measures that directly threaten the freedoms and rights protected by the Joint Declaration. In this respect, the House will be particularly concerned by the potentially wide-ranging ability of the mainland authorities to take jurisdiction over certain cases without any independent oversight and to try those cases in Chinese courts. This measure violates paragraph 3, subparagraph 3 and 5 of the Joint Declaration and directly threatens the rights contained in the UN International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which under the Joint Declaration are to be protected in Hong Kong. And I think in particular it's worth saying that those measures represent a flagrant assault on freedom of speech and freedom of peaceful protest for the people of Hong Kong. Third, Mr. Speaker, the legislation provides that Hong Kong's chief executive, rather than the Chief Justice, will appoint judges to hear national security cases, a move that clearly risks undermining the independence of Hong Kong's judiciary, again, which is protected by paragraph 3, subparagraph 3 of the Joint Declaration. Fourth, Mr. Speaker, the legislation provides for the establishment by the Chinese government of a new Office for Safeguarding National Security in Hong Kong, run by and reporting to the mainland authorities. That is particularly worrying, Mr. Speaker, because that office is given wide-ranging powers, directly intruding on the responsibility of the Hong Kong authorities to maintain public order, again, directly in breach of the Joint Declaration, this time paragraph 3, subparagraph 11. Mr. Speaker, the authorities in Hong Kong have already started to enforce this legislation with reports of arrests by the police and official notices warning the people of Hong Kong against waving flags or chanting. In sum, Mr. Speaker, this legislation has been enacted, as I said, in clear and serious breach of the Joint Declaration. China has broken its promise to the people of Hong Kong under its own laws. China has breached its international obligations to the United Kingdom under the Joint Declaration. And it's also worth saying, Mr. Speaker, that having committed to apply the UN's International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights to the people of Hong Kong, China has now written into law wide-ranging exemptions which cannot credibly be reconciled with its international obligations or indeed its responsibilities as a leading member of the international community. Mr. Speaker, we want a positive relationship with China. We recognise its growth, its stature, and the powerful role it can play in the world. And I would say it is precisely because we respect China as a leading member of the international community, that we expect the Chinese government to meet its international obligations to live up to its international responsibilities. It has failed to do so with respect to Hong Kong by enacting legislation which violates its autonomy and threatens the strangulation of its freedoms. It is a sad day for the people of Hong Kong, and one which can only undermine international trust in the Chinese government's willingness to keep its word and live up to its promises. For our part, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister and the government are crystal clear. The United Kingdom will keep its word. We will live up to our responsibilities to the people of Hong Kong. And I can tell the House that after further detailed discussions with my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, I can now confirm we will proceed to honour our commitment to change the arrangements for those holding B&O status. And I can update honourable members that we have worked with ministers right across Whitehall, and we have now developed proposals for a bespoke immigration route for B&Os and their dependents. We will grant B&Os 5 years limited leave to remain with the right to work or study. After these 5 years, they'll be able to apply for settled status. And after a further 12 months with settled status, they will be able to apply for citizenship. This is a special, bespoke set of arrangements developed for the unique circumstances we faced and in light of our historic commitment to the people of Hong Kong. All of those with B&O status will be eligible, as will their family dependents who are usually resident in Hong Kong, and the Home Office will put in place a simple, streamlined application process, and I can reassure honourable members there will be no quotas on numbers. I want to pay tribute to the Home Secretary and her excellent team at the Home Office for their work and help in preparing, let's face it, for a moment that we all dearly hoped would not arrive. And the Home Secretary will set out further details of our approach in due course. Mr. Speaker, in addition to changing the arrangements for B&Os, the UK will continue to work with our international partners to consider what further action we should responsibly take next. And I can tell the House that yesterday in the United Nations Human Rights Council, the UK made a formal joint statement expressing our deep concern about the human rights situation in both Hong Kong and Xinjiang. Mr. Speaker, 26 other nations joined that statement, and this was the first time a formal statement has been made at the Human Rights Council on this issue, and it was delivered through our diplomatic leadership. We will continue to work with our partners in the G7, partners in the EU, and our partners across the region. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd say again that we want a positive relationship with China, but we will not look the other way when it comes to Hong Kong, and we will not duck our historic responsibilities to its people. We will continue to bring together our international partners, to stand up for the people of Hong Kong, to call out the violations of their freedoms, to hold China to its international obligations freely assumed under international law, and I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Foreign Secretary Lisa Nandy.
Mr. Speaker, the new security law is deeply shocking, and the arrests overnight have stunned the world. This will have a chilling effect on democracy. It fundamentally undermines the commitments made by the Chinese government to the United Kingdom, and in turn the commitments that we made to the people of Hong Kong when we signed the joint declaration. I pressed the Foreign Secretary yesterday not to waver in his commitment to the people of Hong Kong, and I am grateful to him for coming to the House today to make this statement, for advance sight of it, and most of all to honour the promise that he made on the 2nd of June. He is right to do so, and he has our support. Can he tell us when the Home Secretary will provide details of the scheme for B&O passport holders and dependents, and has he made an assessment of likely take-up? Will salary thresholds apply? We are concerned that this must not become a scheme simply for wealthy Hong Kongers to abandon the city and leave others behind. Under the national security law, the government can extract money from those they believe to be involved in criminality or guilty of offences. In some cases, the people of Hong Kong will not be able to take sums of money out of the city. They could have their bank accounts frozen. So what recourse to public funds will apply? And will he ensure that dependents will be treated as home students for the purpose of tuition fees? Mr. Speaker, his commitment to B&O passport holders is welcome. but it does not resolve the problem. I was deeply moved to see the young activists who bravely took to the streets to protest against this law at considerable personal risk. The majority of them will not be covered by this scheme. They must not be abandoned. The loss of many highly skilled workers will be a blow to Hong Kong as well as to China. That is why we need additional measures. We've been waiting in this House for Magnitsky legislation for 2 years now. He must give us a date when that will be brought forward before the summer recess so that targeted sanctions can be applied to those who breach human rights in Hong Kong. Overnight, Mr. Speaker, pepper spray and water cannons were used against the pro-democracy protesters. It is now time for Britain to lead on an inquiry into police brutality. Can I welcome the cross-regional statement that our ambassador coordinated and place on record my thanks to him for his efforts? But will the Foreign Secretary now lead the charge for the appointment of a UN Special Rapporteur on Hong Kong? The provisions in the national security law that encourage people to confess and disclose others' so-called criminal behaviour have raised serious concerns about the prospect of torture. We must not turn away. What conversations has he had with Carrie Lam about the provision for the Chief Executive to handpick judges? And given the comments by the former Hong Kong Chief Justice Andrew Lee that this will fundamentally undermine the independence of the judiciary, what assessment has he made of the continuing role of British judges in the court system? Mr. Speaker, I wrote to him some time ago to ask him to address the direct challenge made by British companies like HSBC and Standard Chartered to the UK's stance by supporting this law. We cannot allow British businesses to become complicit in undermining the international rules-based order that they themselves rely on. Yesterday, he spoke up in defence of press freedom in this place. What discussions is he having with UK news agencies to defend their ability to continue to report freely on the situation on the ground, and with NGOs who will be deeply concerned that this law applies anywhere in the world? Mr. Speaker, the government has taken a step forward today with the announcement of new rights for BNO passport holders and a statement at the United Nations. But this is no substitute for ongoing and sustained international leadership. I urge him to bring forward a comprehensive, detailed and serious package of measures with international partners, as I have outlined. And finally, Mr. Speaker, the government must now develop a much more strategic approach to its engagement with the Chinese government. We support his view that a constructive relationship remains essential. But it is also clear that the UK needs far greater strategic independence in order to speak from and act from a position of values. Will he provide an updated assessment of the implications for national security of the involvement of Huawei in the 5G network? And will he make a similar assessment in relation to the planned nuclear projects involving CGN, Bradwell in particular? I remain deeply concerned, Mr. Speaker, that while this announcement is to be welcomed, his counterparts at the Treasury see Chinese investment as a central plank of the UK's recovery, and that the government's approach remains deeply confused. For too long in relation to China, we have had no strategy at home and no strategy abroad. I hope he can give us a commitment today that this marks the start of a very different era.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Honourable Lady for her support for the action that we're taking on Hong Kong and indeed the measures that we are introducing in relation to BNOs. She made a number of points and lamented the lack of a comprehensive strategy. I'd always be welcome to hear any particular suggestions she's got. I didn't hear any specific suggestions that weren't covered in my statement, but I'm happy to keep engaging with her. She asked about the details of the B&O offer. Of course, the Home Secretary will come forward and in due course, as appropriate, and set out all of those details before the House of Commons. Obviously, there will be all sorts of regulatory arrangements we need to put in place, but the contours of the offer are very clear. We welcome B&Os to come to this country. We say that we've got a specific historic responsibility to them, and there won't be any quota. We are, in relation to a question about numbers, we of course constantly assess the likely take-up think in reality, a large number of those that might be eligible will want to stay in Hong Kong. Others may go to countries in the region, but we've got a historic responsibility and therefore we're making our position clear. And I've also had a number of conversations with our international partners, particularly those with with specific and close relationships with Hong Kong and who have large members of that community in their countries. And I would expect others to be looking very carefully at what they do. She asked about the Magnitsky legislation, said it was promised 2 years ago. It was in the manifesto in the 2019 election. I've been very clear we'll come to the House before recess, not just with the legislation, but the first designations. She also asked about Carrie Lam and representations that have been made to her. Andy Hayne, our Consul General in Hong Kong, spoke to her in the last 24 hours to express our objections to the new legislation. The Foreign Office's Permanent Secretary will also summon the Chinese ambassador to reiterate the points that I've made before the House. I can tell the House that I spoke to Foreign Minister Wang Yi for a considerable period of time on the 8th of June, obviously trying to make clear in advance in order to try and avert this outcome our strong objections to the nature of the legislation. The Honourable Lady also mentioned extraterritoriality. It is a feature, she's right to note, in this legislation. It's not entirely clear how that will be applied in practice, but it is another sobering cause for concern, and I'm joining with her in expressing that. Finally, she asked about Huawei. She will know that the National Cybersecurity Centre are reviewing the situation in relation to Huawei and 5G in light of US sanctions and will report in due course, and I'm sure that the House will be updated as soon as that review is finalised and concluded. But above all, Mr. Speaker, I would like to say to her that it's an important moment across the House where we agree, frankly, on the strategic point that we all wish to make, which is that there has been a clear and serious violation of the Joint Declaration, that we must honour our obligations to B&Os, and also that we must work with our international partners to build the widest caucus and coalition of like-minded countries that say not just on the issue of Hong Kong, but also on the wider question of trust, that China must live up to its international responsibilities.
Chair of the Select Committee, Tom Tugendhat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I first of all welcome the bipartisan nature of this discussion.